Snow drifted across the parking lot. A hush over the world, as if even the air itself didn't want to disturb the silence of that January morning. The old shelter in Vermont stood alone against the white, battered by wind, a place for cast-offs, for the ones nobody else wanted. Inside, the back wing reeked of disinfectant and something sharper. Fear, or maybe the memory of it. The walls held the echo of too many barks and not enough goodbyes. In a corner kennel, almost swallowed by the shadow, lay a black and tan German shepherd. He was bigger than most, bones too prominent under his thick winter coat, eyes like polished stones in the dark. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he barely blinked, just kept watching the world through the bars. The label above read, unadoptable. Abuse. Starvation. Aggression toward male staff. He'd bitten a volunteer once, left a jagged mark. His file was thick, a stack of warnings in red ink. On the other side of me in glass, Dr. Ethan Green lingered, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. He looked like a man who used to stand straighter before life pressed too many burdens onto his shoulders. Once a trauma specialist, now a widower, he'd lost more than his wife in the accident last year. Something in him had gone silent too. The only reason he came today was for his daughter, Abby. He told himself they were just looking, just a field trip, nothing more. Abby was 10, pale from the long winter, dark hair chopped unevenly at the shoulders. She had the kind of quiet eyes that paid attention to things most people missed. The staff had shown her the friendlier dogs first, retrievers with wagging tails, and an eager mutt with a crooked smile. She'd pet them all, murmured hello, but her gaze kept drifting to the back, to the silent kennel. To the dog, no one dared to touch. His name's Shadow. Abby read the sign, her voice just a breath. That's just what they call him, Ethan said. He's not up for adoption, honey. Just here to look, remember? She nodded. The shelter worker hovered behind them, clipboard clutched like a shield. He's unpredictable, the woman warned. Best not to get too close. He's not for families. But Abby was already kneeling, palms on her knees, keeping her distance, but close enough for Shadow to see her. For a long moment, the dog didn't move. His eyes flickered, just a muscle near his jaw tightening. The room felt impossibly still. Abby whispered, "You look like you stopped trusting a long time ago." Something in Shadow's stare shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a faint memory of light passing through a closed window. He didn't approach. He didn't snarl. But he watched her, really watched her, as if measuring something inside. Ethan felt the old ache stir in his chest. He glanced at the clipboard, reading the words he already knew. Do not handle, requires muzzle. Aggressive to male staff. The shelter had called him, knowing his background, asking if he'd consult. He'd nearly said no, but Abby was there, and saying no to her felt like putting another brick between them. The shelter director, Mrs. Donnelly, showed them the rest of the kennels, puppies tumbling over each other, a senior beagle snoring on a worn blanket. But Abby kept glancing back, her eyes lingering at the edge of the hall, pulled by something she couldn't explain. In the break room, Ethan sipped bitter coffee, the kind that leaves a sour taste long after you've swallowed. Mrs. Donnelly sat across from him, lines of worry cutting deep into her forehead. You understand, Dr. Green, we can't let just anyone take him. He's been through more than most. The liability alone, I'm not asking for an exception, Ethan said quietly. But with a trauma plan, a trial period. She shook her head. We've tried. He's been here 6 months. Staff are afraid to go near him. He won't eat in front of people. Won't let anyone touch him except for old Joe. And only on Thursdays. And only when it's raining. There's no trust left in him. Outside the door, Abby's laughter trickled in. She was playing with a 3-legged terrier. Gentle and patient. Ethan's heart twisted. Since the accident, Abby had slept with the lights on. Flinched at sudden noises. Sometimes he caught her staring at her mother's photo. eyes too old for a child. He wondered, not for the first time, if this was all a mistake. Later, as they made their way back to the entrance, Abby paused at Shadow's kennel again. She pressed her hand against the glass. For the briefest second, Shadow's gaze met hers, and the world felt quieter. Ethan saw something pass between them. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the first crack in a wall, built by fear. When they reached the car, Abby said, "He's not mean, he's just scared." Ethan knelt beside her in the parking lot, snow squeaking under his boots. Some dogs, some people, they get so hurt, they don't know how to let anyone in anymore. She looked up at him, eyes shining with the kind of certainty only kids have. But if no one tries, then nothing ever changes. That night, after Abby was asleep, Ethan sat in the dim kitchen, the silence pressing in around him. He pulled out his laptop, opened his old files, case notes from his practice, therapy plans, trauma models. He drafted a letter, a detailed recovery plan, step by step, gradual exposure, no forced interaction, weekly check-ins, full liability on him. He sent it to the shelter, not expecting a reply. 3 days later, his phone rang. Mrs. Donnelly's voice was tired but hopeful. "We'll give you a 10-day trial. Strict rules. You'll have to sign for full responsibility. He travels muzzled, must be introduced slowly, no contact with strangers, no surprises." Ethan agreed. The next afternoon, he and Abby returned. They watched as the staff coaxed Shadow into a crate, and no growling, just a tense, expectant silence. The drive home was silent, the dog curled at the back, eyes wide and unblinking. At the house, Ethan carried the crate into the laundry room, set up a secure pen, left food and water nearby. Shadow wouldn't look at anyone, wouldn't eat. Abby left him comics and her favorite stuffed bear outside the crate. No interaction, just her presence, gentle, patient. That first night, as the wind howled outside and the house settled into uneasy quiet, Ethan lay awake, listening for any sound from the laundry room. There was none, only the faint, almost imperceptible presence of hope settling in, fragile as the snow that kept falling. He didn't know yet if they were saving the dog, or if he and Abby were the ones in need of rescue. The house always felt a little too quiet after sunset. Out on the porch, wind chimes tangled and whispered, their notes almost lost beneath the hush of falling snow. Inside, Ethan watched the clock on the kitchen wall, waiting for some sign, some confirmation that this wasn't all a terrible mistake. Shadow's crate sat at the far end of the laundry room, door open, but the dog hadn't budged in hours. He was a shape in the dimness, breathing so quietly that Abby checked twice to make sure he was real. Food and water sat untouched. Every small movement in the house, a door creaking, the furnace groaning, made Shadow tense, eyes following every shadow on the wall. Abby hovered near the threshold, never pushing, just placing a new comic or a soft toy each morning and evening. She talked sometimes, not expecting answers, reading from her books about superheroes and worlds where good always won. She didn't tell anyone at school about Shadow. It felt too fragile, like a secret wish whispered to the moon. Ethan followed the recovery plan down to every detail. No forced eye contact, no sudden movements, gentle routines. Each night, he logged Shadow's behavior on his old laptop, his notes mingling with memories from another life. Sometimes he wondered if the shelter's warnings echoed too loudly in his mind, drowning out his own instincts. He'd seen trauma up close, both animal and human. But living with it day by day was something else entirely. On the fourth day, the shelter's volunteer, Joe, a gray-bearded man with a soft voice, called to check in. "Eaten?" Joe asked. Ethan shook his head, though Joe couldn't see him. "Not while we're in the room, maybe late at night, when it's quiet. He's watching, though. Always watching." Joe chuckled, a sound like gravel. "He'll come around? They always do, if you give him time and space. Just gotta let him see you're not going anywhere." After the call, Ethan sat on the laundry room floor, close enough for Shadow to sense him, but far enough not to threaten. He started reading old articles aloud, his voice even, steady. letting it fill the space with something warm. In the silence between paragraphs, he heard the faint shuffle of paws, the scratch of nails on linoleum. Shadow was listening, even if he pretended not to care. The tension in the house shifted, subtle as a new current under the surface. Ethan noticed it in small ways. Shadow moving a few inches closer to the open crate door, ears flicking when Abby's laughter echoed from her bedroom, a barely audible sigh when Ethan set down the food bowl and left without looking back. The fifth night came with a brittle cold, the kind that made windows frost at the corners and old floorboards pop in protest. Abby sat at the kitchen table, homework forgotten, her gaze drifting to the laundry room door. "Do you think he'll ever want to come out?" she asked. Ethan smiled, tired but genuine. "It's up to him, honey. Some hurts take longer to heal than others." A silence fell between them, thick with all the things they both wanted but were too afraid to say. Outside, snow fell, in heavy sheets, blanketing the world in white. That was when it happened. A soft sound, barely louder than the hush of the furnace. A jingle, almost musical, rang out from the back of the house. Abby froze, heart hammering. Ethan set down his coffee, nerves prickling. The bell. He tied it to the laundry room's back door so they'd hear if Shadow moved, never expecting it would actually ring. Slowly, Ethan made his way down the hall, Abby trailing behind. He paused at the threshold. There, in the pool of yellow lamplight, Shadow stood just inside the door, leash trailing from his collar, staring at the handle with something close to curiosity. The dog's eyes flicked to Ethan, then to Abby. He didn't bolt, didn't bare his teeth. He just waited, tense but present, as if daring them to break the spell. Ethan's voice was low, gentle. "You want to go outside, buddy?" Shadow's tail twitched. Not a wag, just the barest movement, but it was enough. Abby stayed back, hands behind her back, holding her breath. Ethan clipped the leash on, opened the door, and let the cold night air rush in. Snowflakes swirled in the porch light, silver against the dark. Shadow stepped out, slow and cautious. Nose lifted, ears swiveling as he took in the smells of the yard. A world wider than the laundry room, alive with mystery. Ethan kept the leash loose, but firm. He followed as Shadow crept forward, every muscle tense but controlled. For a moment, Ethan was certain the dog would try to bolt, but Shadow only paused, sniffed the wind, and then, remarkably, sat. Just like that, in the snow, he sat and stared up at the stars. Abby watched through the glass, face pressed to the window. "He's not running away." "No," Ethan whispered. "He's just looking." That night, something changed. Back inside, Shadow retreated to his corner, but didn't curl so tightly into himself. He ate, slowly, methodically, while Abby hummed softly from the next room, a half-remembered lullaby filling the space between them. The old stuffed bear lay by the food bowl, untouched, but no longer rejected. As the clock ticked past midnight, Ethan sat in the kitchen, listening to the quiet. The tension he'd carried for days, weeks, months. It eased, just a little the way snow softens the world's hard edges. In that fragile peace, he realized that recovery wasn't about big leaps, but about the small, nearly invisible moments that built trust, one heartbeat at a time. Later, as Ethan peeked into the laundry room, he saw Shadow's eyes watching him in the darkness, less wary, more curious. Abby's comics were stacked neatly against the wall, and the bear sat upright, as if waiting for tomorrow. He whispered, "We're not going anywhere, boy. Not tonight. Not ever." Somewhere in the shadows, a wounded heart beat a little stronger. The days that followed seemed to pass in slow motion, the world outside buried deeper beneath Vermont snow. Inside, the greenhouse shifted around its new axis, 3 beings, each wounded in their own way, circling quietly around each other. Every morning, Ethan would find a little more evidence that Shadow was exploring, when no one was watching. A food bowl licked clean, paw prints tracked across the laundry room tiles, the corner of a comic book chewed and left abandoned near the crate. Shadow never let himself be caught in the act. But something had changed since that first night in the yard. His presence was less ghostly, his eyes following Ethan and Abby, not with suspicion, but with silent questions. For Abby, each sign of progress was a tiny miracle. She took to sitting cross-legged in the hallway after school, reading her favorite stories aloud, her voice soft but sure. She told Shadow about her old best friend who'd moved away, about her secret wish to be brave, about the way winter turned the world quiet, just like him. Sometimes she'd glance up and catch the faintest flicker of attention in those amber eyes through the cracked laundry door. Ethan kept to his routines, working from home in the mornings, taking careful notes on Shadow's patterns, logging every small victory. He didn't tell anyone from his old life about the dog. Not his colleagues at the clinic, not the neighbors who'd stopped inviting him over since the accident. This was their journey, just the three of them. On the fifth night, after a dinner of boxed macaroni and carrot sticks, Ethan found Abby perched by the back door, bundled in 2 sweaters and her favorite knitted hat. She was staring at the brass bell tied to the door handle, a relic from his wife's childhood home in Maine. The bell had hung on their doors for years, marking every entrance and exit with a sweet, familiar jingle. Since Shadow's arrival, it had stayed silent. "Why does it have a bell?" Abby asked, tracing the frayed red ribbon. "So we can hear when someone comes or goes," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. "Or maybe so we remember to listen." She considered this, then nodded solemnly. "If he ever comes out, will you let him?" Ethan looked at her, surprised by the raw hope in her question. "If he wants to go outside, we'll go together." That night, as a bitter wind rattled the windows, the house settled into its usual hush. Ethan read in the living room, the lamp throwing soft light over the old brown couch. Abby drew comics at the kitchen table, sketching a caped hero with a German shepherd sidekick. The rest of the world faded to white noise, the only real sound, the low hum of the refrigerator, and far away, the shifting hush of falling snow. Then, from the back of the house, a sound cut through the silence. Jingle. Not loud, but clear. The bell by the laundry room door had moved. Ethan's heart thudded. He set his book aside and motioned silently for Abby to follow. They padded quietly down the hallway, breath caught in their throats. At the threshold of the laundry room, Ethan paused, Abby peeking from behind his arm. Shadow stood before the door, his massive frame tense but upright. His leash, left loosely attached as part of the routine, dangled from his collar. He glanced at Ethan, then at Abby, then back to the door, as if considering every possible outcome before making a move. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "It's okay, Shadow. Let's go outside." He moved slowly, making no sudden gestures, his hands open and visible. He unclipped the leash from its hook, looped it gently through the collar, all the while murmuring quiet reassurances. Abby stayed just outside the room, hands fisted in her shirt, hope and fear mingling in her small frame. Shadow didn't bolt. He didn't flinch. Instead, he waited, patient as if measuring their trust with his own. Ethan unlatched the door, letting in a blast of freezing air. Snowflakes eddied at their feet, crisp and wild. Shadow sniffed the air, his nose working, then took a single step onto the porch. Outside, the night was a world of blue shadows and cold starlight. The backyard, fenced for safety, was wide enough for Shadow to explore, but secure enough that he couldn't escape if he panicked. For a moment, Ethan feared the worst. That Shadow would tear free, disappear into the night, become just another story of loss. But Shadow did not run. He moved cautiously, placing each paw with deliberate care, ears swiveling to track every distant sound. He sniffed the ground, the posts, the winter air itself, as if searching for some piece of himself he'd lost long ago. Abby watched through the frosted glass, her breath fogging the window, too awestruck to speak. Ethan let out a slow breath. He knelt in the snow, letting Shadow circle him, leash slack. There, under the glow of the porch light, man and dog existed together in the fragile trust of a moment, each aware of the other's wounds, neither pushing for more than the other could give. After several minutes, Shadow turned back toward the house, eyes softer, almost resigned. Ethan let him lead the way, the leash still loose between them. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. Shadow hesitated in the doorway, then with a soft grunt walked calmly back to the laundry room. He stopped, glanced over his shoulder at Abby and Ethan, and, just for a second, allowed himself to be seen. That night, Shadow ate with the door open. Abby sat on the hallway floor, humming quietly, her voice carrying across the cold tile. Shadow didn't look at her, but he didn't shy away either. When Ethan peeked in, he saw the old bear tucked beside Shadow's blanket, the comic book just within reach. Later, Abby crawled onto the couch, head on Ethan's lap. "He trusts us a little now?" She whispered. "Not much, but a little." Ethan stroked her hair, feeling the weight of the last year lighten, if only for a moment. "That's all we need," he said. "Just a little, to start." As the house slipped into sleep, the bell by the door swayed in the breeze, catching every shift and stirring as a promise. Change was possible, even for those who had been silent the longest. And in the laundry room, a pair of wary eyes closed at last, the darkness not quite so empty anymore. Morning sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, painting the tiles in gold and shadow. The world outside still wore its heavy coat of snow, but inside something had shifted. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. It held a cautious sort of hope, like a sprout pushing up through frozen earth. Abby was the first to notice the new rhythm. Each morning, as she came downstairs, she'd find Shadow lying near the laundry room's open doorway, not inside, not outside, but at the threshold, his silent eyes tracking every movement. She moved gently, placing her backpack and coat in the same spot every day, speaking softly as if careful not to shatter the fragile piece. Shadow still didn't approach, but he didn't hide anymore either. Ethan watched it all unfold, the small moments stacking up like pebbles in a jar. A flick of the dog's ear when Abby sang along to the radio, a soft sigh when Ethan sat nearby and read aloud. Every evening, Shadow ate a little closer to the door. Every night he shifted his blanket a little further from the wall. One gray Tuesday, the ordinary calm of their world was broken. Abby was sketching at the kitchen table. Doodles of capes and comic heroes, her pencils scattered in a cheerful mess, when a sudden, jarring bang rattled the porch. The mailbox clanged. A package thudded against the wooden planks. Abby's pencil froze mid-sketch. Her heart skipped. Shadow, who'd been dozing in the laundry doorway, snapped upright, muscles rigid, eyes wide and electric. Before Abby could call out, Shadow darted forward. Not at the door, but sideways, slipping between Abby and the sound outside, body low and ready. He didn't bark. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood, still as a statue, blocking the invisible threat. Ethan, in his office, heard the noise and hurried into the kitchen, pulse racing. He paused at the sight. Abby frozen, eyes huge, shadow planted squarely between her and the door, gaze locked on the source of the commotion. It was a scene Ethan knew all too well from his clinic days. Fight or flight, the instant readiness born from trauma. Yet Shadow's stance held no malice. Only raw, instinctive purpose. Protection. Abby found her voice. Trembling but brave. "He's not mad, Daddy. He's, keeping me safe." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He approached slowly, careful not to startle the dog. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. Just the mailman." His shadow flicked his ears, glancing from Ethan to Abby as if assessing their calm. Slowly, so slowly, his shoulders loosened. His tail didn't wag, but it dropped from its stiff, defensive arch. The mail carrier's footsteps crunched away, leaving only silence and the lingering echo of adrenaline. Abby knelt beside Shadow, still not touching, but close enough for him to feel her presence. "You didn't run. You stayed with me." Shadow's only answer was a quiet exhale, but something in his eyes, relief, maybe, or gratitude, softened. He shifted, settling down beside Abby's chair, his body curving protectively around her feet. That day, the balance of trust tipped again. For the first time, Abby sat in the living room with her homework. Shadow stretched out nearby. He watched every movement, Ethan pouring coffee, Abby giggling at her comic book, but never looked away. The world, with all its loud noises and sudden surprises, didn't scare him as much when his people were close. Later that week, Ethan recounted the moment during the shelter's scheduled check-in call. Mrs. Donnelly listened in silence, her sigh crackling through the phone. "That's new," she said. "Shadow's always been a runner. When he's afraid, he bolts. Never seen him stand his ground for anyone." Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, rubbing tired eyes. "He's not running anymore. Not from us." There were setbacks, of course. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in without warning, lightning splitting the sky, thunder rattling the windows. Shadow bolted for his crate, whimpering low and fast, the past flooding back in sound and fury. Abby waited until the worst had passed, then curled up outside the crate, her back pressed to the bars. She didn't try to coax him out. She just stayed, humming softly. Eventually, the tremors eased. Shadow inched forward until his nose rested against Abby's pajama-clad shoulder. These victories were small, but they mattered. A few days later, Ethan left the back door open while carrying groceries inside. The wind caught the door, slamming it shut with a sharp bang. Shadow startled, but instead of vanishing, he moved to the window, watching until Ethan returned. There was a new alertness in his posture, less the wariness of a cornered animal, more the vigilance of a sentry. Abby noticed it too. She drew new comics, this time with her superhero, accompanied not by a generic dog, but by a black and tan German shepherd, bold and loyal, always between her and the world. Or, one quiet evening, as the sun set in streaks of purple and orange, Abby sat on the porch steps, her knees hugged to her chest. Shadow hovered at the threshold, uncertain. Abby didn't call him. She just waited, letting the silence say what words couldn't. After a long minute, Shadow ventured outside, paws crunching softly on the snow-dusted boards. He sat beside her, not touching, but close enough to share the quiet. She whispered, "It's okay to be scared." "I get scared too." Shadow turned his head, met her eyes. For the first time, he looked not through her, but at her, recognizing something in her fear that matched his own. Inside, Ethan watched through the kitchen window, heart swelling with a pride so fierce it hurt. For months, he doubted his ability to heal, to father, to love after such deep loss. But here, in the soft hush of evening, he saw the fragile threads of trust binding the three of them together, stronger every day. That night, Abby told Ethan, "He's not just a dog. He's my shadow. He's part of us now." Ethan tucked her in, then stood at the doorway, watching a shadow settled outside Abby's room, a silent guardian against nightmares. The house, once haunted by absence, was filling up with life again. And somewhere, in the gentle dark, the old bell by the door swayed softly, marking each heartbeat of a family finding its way back to each other. The snow began to melt in slow surrender, revealing patches of sodden grass and forgotten toys Abby had left out months before. The world thawed by inches, but inside the greenhouse, changes unfolded with greater courage and certainty. Shadow was no longer just a presence at the edge of vision. He became part of the household rhythm, a silent thread weaving together the unraveling corners of their days. Abby noticed the difference first. Every morning, as she shuffled down the stairs, she'd find Shadow lying on the landing, his big paws crossed, eyes already waiting for her. If she woke in the night from a bad dream, she'd glimpse his silhouette outside her door, unmoving, calm as stone. He made no sound, but his presence was a quiet promise. You are not alone. It was Abby who gave him his name. She'd tried out others at first, Hero, Bear, even Buddy, but none fit. One rainy afternoon, after a long session with her crayons and a stack of comic books, she looked up at the black and tan shape curled at her feet and spoke softly, as if realizing something important. "Shadow, that's your name. Because you follow me even when I don't see you?" Ethan heard from the kitchen and smiled to himself. The name felt right, inevitable. Like it had been waiting in the air, unspoken, until someone finally saw him for who he was. From that day, Abby addressed him as Shadow. At first, the dog responded only with a slow blink, but the more she spoke the name, the less he flinched, the more his tail would stir in a barely perceptible wag. Even Ethan caught himself whispering it, late at night when the world was still. "Good night, Shadow," he'd murmur, just before turning out the light. Each time it felt like another stone placed in the foundation of their new life. Shadow's boundaries softened, inch by inch. He began lying outside Abby's bedroom at night, silent but steadfast. On weekends, Abby would read aloud from her comics on the hallway floor, her voice filling the space with adventure. Shadow would settle nearby, listening with one ear cocked, but sometimes shifting closer until their shoulders almost touched. There were moments of regression. A slammed door would make him startle. The rumble of the garbage truck sent him cowering to his safe space in the laundry room. But he recovered faster each time, his fear now interrupted by flickers of trust. One evening, while Ethan folded laundry in the den, he heard the soft patter of paws behind him. Shadow had entered the room, something he'd never done before. Ethan kept his movements slow, resisting the urge to reach out. He set a clean towel beside him and waited. Shadow circled, sniffed the air, and then deliberately lowered himself beside Ethan. The silence between them was charged, electric, every second a small leap of faith. Ethan reached out, hand trembling a little, and brushed his palm over Shadow's shoulder. The dog tensed, muscles hard under fur, but didn't pull away. Ethan moved his hand in slow, even strokes, letting Shadow feel the weight of his calm. Abby peeked in, eyes wide. She pressed a hand over her mouth to hold back a gasp of excitement. Sensing that any sudden sound might shatter the spell, Shadow let out a deep sigh and relaxed beneath Ethan's touch. For the first time, the barrier of fear gave way to something softer. In that quiet, the house felt less like a shell and more like a home. Later that night, as rain tapped softly against the window panes, Ethan lingered by Abby's door, listening to her steady breathing. Shadow lay curled in the hallway, his back pressed against the wood, as if guarding the dreams within. Ethan crouched down, ruffling the dog's ears, whispering, "You're doing good, Shadow. You belong here." Abby's room became the heart of their evenings. She'd invent stories about a girl and her loyal dog, a Shadow who protected her from monsters and loneliness, who braved dark forests and blizzards. Shadow, she declared, was the hero, not the sidekick. Ethan found himself pulled into their orbit, joining Abby in her bedtime rituals. He started reading out loud again, his voice regaining its warmth as he followed her lead. Sometimes, Shadow would inch close enough for Ethan to rest a gentle hand on his head. The physical contact, once impossible, became a new language, a language of patience and forgiveness. On Saturdays, Abby convinced Ethan to try brushing Shadow with the old soft bristled brush they'd found in a forgotten drawer. The first attempt was tense, Shadow stiff and wary, but with each careful stroke, with Abby's quiet encouragement and Ethan's steady hands, the dog relaxed, fur shining beneath their attention. The greatest test came on a blustery March morning when a neighbor's teenage son stopped by to return a lost baseball glove. The doorbell rang, and Shadow immediately shot to his feet, posture alert, tail low. Ethan hurried to intercept the visitor, but Abby, sensing the tension, stepped between Shadow and the door. "It's okay, Shadow," she said, her voice calm. "He's a friend." The boy handed over the glove, glancing nervously at the large German shepherd. To everyone's surprise, Shadow stood his ground, not threatening, but present, watching. No growl, no bark. He let Ethan shake the boy's hand, then turned and padded quietly back to his spot outside Abby's room. That small victory lit up the rest of the day. Abby sketched a new comic that evening. The main character, unmistakably Shadow. Strong, stoic, a gentle protector. Ethan taped it to the fridge as a badge of honor. The family's routines now revolved around Shadow. Mealtimes included an extra bowl. On the kitchen floor, Abby's stories always featured a loyal companion at her side. Even their silences, once heavy and hollow, were now filled with a quiet understanding, a shared healing. At night, as Ethan watched Abby drift off to sleep and Shadow settle into his spot by her door, he felt gratitude pulse through him, a gratitude so fierce it brought tears to his eyes. The house, once defined by grief, now glowed with the fragile warmth of hope, and through it all, Shadow grew into his name, not just a ghost at the edge of things, but a steadfast presence, a promise that, even in the darkness, none of them would ever be truly alone again. Vermont was never gentle with its winters, and when the blizzard rolled in, it did so with a silent, absolute force. The day began with gray clouds heavy over the hills, a hush in the air that made Ethan pause at the kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hand. By afternoon, snowflakes as wide as nickels battered the glass, swirling in thick, relentless sheets. The world beyond their porch vanished, first the trees, then the road, until nothing existed but white. Inside, the greenhouse hunkered down. Ethan double-checked the flashlights and extra blankets. Abby helped him stack canned food and water in the pantry. Shadow padded from room to room, ears pricked, uneasy but not panicked, sensing the change. By early evening, the wind howled through the eaves and rattled the window frames. Abby curled on the couch with a book and her favorite blanket, Shadow lying close enough that she could feel his warmth. Ethan built a fire in the living room, trying to coax some cheer into the drafty space. The power flickered twice before it died for good, plunging the house into darkness lit only by the fireplace's golden glow. The sudden loss of electricity made the silence deeper. For a moment, nobody moved. Abby's voice was small. "What do we do now?" Ethan put on his best smile. "We camp out in the living room, just like the pioneers. We have the fire. We have stories. And we have each other." Abby grinned, braver than she felt, and began to gather her pillows. Shadow stayed close, a black shape in the flickering light, eyes luminous and watchful. But as night settled in, the furnace failed, and the cold crept through the walls, finding every gap and crack. Abby shivered, huddling deeper beneath her blanket, teeth chattering in spite of the fire. Ethan wrapped another quilt around her shoulders and stoked the flames, but nothing could keep the deep cold fully at bay. Shadow paced, anxious. The storm outside raged with new fury. Every blast of wind rattled the doors, every swirl of snow pressed against the windows. Abby tried to read, but her fingers shook. She glanced at Shadow, then at her father, her breath catching in the frigid air. "Daddy, I can't sleep," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan knelt beside her, brushing a cold strand of hair from her face. He saw the worry in her eyes, the old fear of being left alone, magnified by the dark, the cold, and the memory of nights when her mother was still alive. He wrapped his arms around her, wishing his warmth could be enough. Then without warning, Shadow moved. He climbed onto the rug beside Abby, nudging her gently with his nose. His fur was thick, radiating a steady, reassuring heat. Abby hesitated, uncertain, then reached out and let her hand rest on his back. Shadow lay down beside her, curling his body against hers, forming a barrier against the chill. Ethan watched, something twisting in his chest. It was a small miracle, one he didn't dare interrupt. He tossed another log on the fire and dimmed the lantern, letting the shadows grow long and soft across the floor. Abby tucked her fingers into Shadow's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. She buried her face in his side, his warmth and presence chasing the cold from her bones. For the first time that night, her breathing slowed, her body relaxing as sleep crept in. Shadow didn't move, didn't flinch at the storm's violence. He simply stayed, a silent guardian in the heart of the darkness. Ethan found himself lingering at the doorway, watching them. The fire crackled, the blizzard howled, but inside the circle of warmth and trust, something old and broken within him began to mend. He thought of his wife, the way she used to sing Abby to sleep on stormy nights, the way she believed that love could heal even the deepest wounds. As tonight, with Shadow curled against Abby, Ethan let himself believe it too. He sank to his knees, resting his head on the edge of the couch, silent tears of relief and gratitude streaming down his cheeks. For months, the house had felt haunted by loss, By silence? By all the words they never said. Now, in the glow of the fire, he heard the pulse of life again. Shadow, once so frightened, had chosen to offer comfort instead of fleeing. The blizzard battered on. Hours passed. Abby slept soundly, curled around Shadow, her hand never leaving his fur. Shadow never moved from her side, except to glance at Ethan now and then, as if seeking his approval. In the deep of the night, the fire died low. Ethan covered the embers and piled more blankets over Abby and Shadow, careful not to disturb them. He lay on the floor, nearby, letting exhaustion finally pull him under. When morning arrived, the world outside was still. Snow blanketing the yard, trees sagging with ice. As sunlight pierced the clouds, dazzling and cold, the house was quiet, peaceful. Abby woke first, blinking at the soft light, and found Shadow watching her, his eyes gentle and clear. She smiled and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. "Thank you, Shadow," she whispered. Shadow licked her hand, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Ethan stirred, sore from the hard floor, but grateful for the sight before him. He knelt beside Abby and Shadow, pulling them both into his embrace. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt the weight of fear ease, replaced by the fragile warmth of hope and belonging. That morning, the power returned, the house humming back to life. The ordeal of the blizzard became another story, one they would tell each other for years, a memory of survival and love in the face of darkness. But more than anything, it became a turning point. The day the walls of grief and mistrust fell away, when a wounded dog chose to offer warmth instead of retreating, and when a family, broken by loss, began to heal together. From then on, Shadow no longer slept outside Abby's door. He slept beside her bed, close enough for her to reach out in the night and know that, whatever storms came, she would never be alone again. When spring finally clawed its way through the snowbanks, Vermont changed overnight. The ice melted into running water, sunlight stretched farther across the hills, and the air was sharp with the smell of mud and pine. After months of quiet routines, the whole town seemed to lean forward, eager for newness, for movement, for a hint of joy. For the Greens, life followed a careful rhythm. Abby returned to school, her stories of Shadow now peppered with laughter instead of fear. Ethan took on more work from home, finding comfort in the gentle distractions of domestic life. And Shadow, once a silent shadow himself, now watched over every detail, greeting Abby at the door, patrolling the backyard fence, napping in whatever patch of sunlight he could claim. It was on one of those early spring afternoons that the town's calm was shattered. The phone call came just as Ethan was finishing lunch, the sun slanting across the kitchen table. Abby was in her room, drawing, and Shadow was curled at her feet. The voice on the line was urgent, trembling. It was Mrs. Donnelly from the shelter. "Ethan, have you seen the news? There's a boy missing. Tommy Paxton from the high school. They think he wandered off on the nature trail up by Miller's Woods." The words landed with a dull weight. Ethan's mind flashed to the stories, kids lost in the cold, hours ticking by, hope fraying with each passing minute. He remembered his own sessions at the clinic, the faces of parents desperate for any kind of miracle. He found Abby and told her gently, "The Paxtons need help. The town is organizing a search. I'll go check in, all right?" Abby nodded, her face grave. "Can I come?" Ethan hesitated. He saw the determination in her eyes, the same stubborn hope that had brought Shadow into their lives. He nodded. "But you stay close, and Shadow stays with you." Within the hour, the Green family arrived at the trailhead, a growing knot of neighbors and volunteers huddled together. The police were there, radios crackling, faces set and grim. Beyond the parking lot, the woods stretched wild and tangled, sunlight barely touching the forest floor. A cold wind cut through the trees, snapping branches and carrying the shouts of searchers deeper into the brush. Ethan reported in, giving their names, promising to stick to the marked paths. Abby stood beside him, one hand on Shadow's collar, her jaw set with purpose. It was chaos. People calling, dogs barking, the ground still slick with leftover ice. Searchers moved in tight lines, voices echoing through the trees. Ethan felt old instincts kick in. Scan for clues, listen for any sound, keep Abby safe. Shadow, meanwhile, was electric with tension. His ears were sharp, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents, posture taut. He seemed to understand something was wrong. His family was tense, and strangers moved through the woods in nervous, noisy groups. For the first half hour, their search was careful and methodical. Abby called Tommy's name, her voice thin against the wind. Shadow moved between Abby and Ethan, checking the trail, nose to the ground. Then, as they reached a fork in the trail, Shadow froze. His head snapped up, ears pricked, body suddenly rigid. He stared northeast, deeper into the woods, away from the main group of searchers. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Shadow whined, a sound Abby had never heard from him before. Low and insistent, his entire body vibrating with urgency. Ethan looked down at his daughter, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Abby gripped Shadow's leash. "Dad, follow him, please. He knows." Ethan hesitated only a second. "Okay, buddy, show us." They broke from the line, weaving through undergrowth and fallen branches. Shadow pulled ahead, nose to the dirt, legs pumping in a desperate, determined rhythm. Abby stumbled, Ethan steadying her, but neither let go. The woods grew thicker, shadows tangled with sunlight. It was colder here, the ground muddy and treacherous. Ethan's heart pounded, part fear, part hope. He called Tommy's name, listening for anything but the wind. Then, suddenly, Shadow stopped. He barked. Once, sharp and loud, not with aggression, but as a signal. Ethan rounded a fallen pine, breath caught in his chest. There, half buried beneath branches, lay a boy in a bright blue jacket. Tommy Paxton. He was conscious, but his skin was pale, lips tinged blue. He shivered violently, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Abby gasped, rushing forward, but Ethan caught her arm. "Wait," he said gently. "Let Shadow help." Shadow moved first, approaching Tommy in a slow, cautious circle. He sniffed the boy, then pressed his body close, lying alongside him in the mud. The heat of the dog's body seemed to ground the boy, his shaking easing just a little. Ethan knelt and pulled out his phone, hands trembling as he called for help. "We found him. Miller's Woods, Northeast Trail, past the big pine. He's cold, maybe hypothermic, but he's awake." Abby crouched beside Tommy, pulling off her scarf and wrapping it around his neck. "It's okay. You're safe. Shadow's here." Tommy managed a weak smile. "Dog's warm." Shadow stayed pressed to the boy, sharing every ounce of heat, eyes alert. Abby stroked his head, whispering quiet encouragement. Minutes felt like hours. Then at last, voices approached, first distant, then closer. The search team arrived, paramedics with blankets and warm packs. They worked quickly, lifting Tommy onto a stretcher, checking his vitals. One medic paused, glancing at Shadow. He saved him, no question. Dog kept him from freezing. Ethan felt the world tilt, gratitude flooding through him. He hugged Abby close, pride and relief warring in his chest. As they walked back toward the parking lot, Shadow at their side, the searchers clapped Ethan on the back, some kneeling to pat Shadow, murmuring their thanks. For the first time, Shadow didn't flinch. He watched each stranger, wary but calm, tail resting in the muddy grass. Abby looked up at her father, eyes shining. "Shadow's a hero." Ethan nodded, tears thick in his throat. "He really is." That night, as the house settled into quiet once more, Abby curled beside Shadow on her bedroom floor. She whispered stories of heroes and lost boys, of deep woods, and the warm heart of a dog who always found his way home. And in the darkness, Shadow stayed close, no longer just a survivor, but a rescuer, a friend, and finally, family. After the rescue in Miller's Woods, the Green household took on a subtle glow, a quiet confidence that hadn't existed before. Abby walked taller at school, her stories about Shadow now spoken with pride. Her friends leaned in closer, their skepticism replaced with a kind of awe. Even Ethan noticed the change in his own reflection. Something softer around his eyes, something lighter in his step. It was as if Shadow's courage in the woods had loosened a knot inside each of them, but the ordeal had also left its marks. After spending hours pressed against Tommy's shivering body in the freezing mud, Shadow's thick coat was soaked and filthy. He limped a little on his left hind leg, his energy dipping lower than usual in the days that followed. Ethan monitored him closely, taking his temperature, checking for wounds, offering bits of chicken and soft words of encouragement. Abby made a nest of blankets on the living room floor and insisted on sleeping nearby, one hand always buried in Shadow's fur. By Thursday morning, Ethan knew it was time to see Dr. Patel, the local vet. Shadow had always tensed up in new places. His records from the shelter were full of anxious notes, incidents with staff, nervous aggression towards strangers. Ethan scheduled an early appointment, wanting the office as quiet as possible. The morning was crisp and bright. As they loaded Shadow into the back seat, Abby rode next to him, gently stroking his ears. Ethan drove slowly, one eye on the mirror. The whole way, Shadow sat tall but calm, his breath slow, his gaze steady on Abby's hands. When they reached the clinic, Abby looped her fingers through Shadow's collar and led him through the glass doors. Inside, the waiting room was nearly empty. A woman sat with a nervous tabby in a carrier. A small boy twisted in his chair, swinging his feet, clutching a bandaged guinea pig to his chest. The place smelled of antiseptic and dog biscuits, of old fears and hopeful beginnings. Ethan filled out the paperwork, his hands shaking only a little. Abby chose a spot near the window, her arm still draped over Shadow's shoulders. He sat beside her, upright, watchful, but not afraid. He let her brush bits of dirt from his fur with slow, careful movements. When a nurse walked by, he didn't flinch or growl. Instead, he lowered his head, tail steady on the floor. The little boy with the guinea pig sidled over, eyes huge and curious. "Is he a police dog?" he asked, his voice no louder than a whisper. Abby grinned, pride shimmering in her reply. "He's our rescue dog. He saved a boy in the woods last week." The boy reached out with a tentative hand. Abby glanced at Ethan. He nodded. She looked at Shadow. "It's okay, Shadow. He's gentle." Shadow studied the boy for a long moment, his ears pricked, his nose twitching at the scent of bandages and fear. Then, in a gesture so simple it felt like a miracle, he lowered his head and allowed the boy to pet him. The boy's hand was careful, reverent, and Shadow sat perfectly still, his breath steady, eyes soft. The nurse at the counter watched, mouth open in quiet surprise. She whispered to Ethan, "He was on the do not handle list at the shelter, wasn't he? This is something." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "He's changed. Or, maybe we did." Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway, calling their name. Shadow stood, Abby at his side. They walked together down the hall, Shadow's leash loose and Abby's gentle grip. In the exam room, Dr. Patel greeted Shadow with a calm smile, moving slowly, letting the dog sniff her open palm. Shadow's posture was wary but trusting. He allowed her to examine his paw, check his joints, clean his ears. "He's healing well," Dr. Patel said, smiling at Abby. "He's a little stiff, but that's to be expected after what he did." "You're taking good care of him?" Abby glowed under the praise. "He takes care of us, too." As Dr. Patel finished up, there was a commotion in the hallway. A door banging, hurried voices. A child cried out, scared. Shadow stiffened but did not react with fear or aggression. Instead, he pressed close to Abby, his presence a steady comfort. The crying faded. The exam room felt warm and safe. Ethan knelt beside his daughter, emotion catching in his throat. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice thick. "Both of you." The walk back through the waiting room was different from the walk in. Shadow walked calmly at Abby's side, pausing as the little boy waved goodbye, letting the woman with the cat pet his head. Strangers greeted them with smiles, some reaching out to touch Shadow's silky ears. Outside, spring sunlight shimmered on the sidewalk, Ethan held the car door open, and Abby guided Shadow in. She slid in beside him, her hand never leaving his back. On the drive home, Abby pressed her face to the dog's neck, whispering, "You're the bravest dog I know. I hope you know you're safe now. I hope you know you're loved." Shadow leaned into her, eyes half closed in contentment. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the air cooled again, the house filled with gentle laughter and the clatter of dishes. Abby did her homework at the kitchen table. Shadow sprawled beneath her feet. Ethan watched them both, heart full, remembering all the nights when this kind of peace felt impossible. Later, before bed, Ethan called his mother. He told her about Shadow at the vet, about the little boy and the guinea pig, about the way Abby's hand never left the dog's fur. There were tears on both ends of the line, tears of relief, of gratitude, of wonder at how much can change when you choose to stay. As darkness settled over the house, Abby lay in bed, Shadow curled at her side. "He's not just our dog, Daddy," she said, sleep thick in her voice. "He's a friend. He's family." Ethan kissed her forehead, his voice soft. "He's a miracle, Abby, for all of us." Shadow let out a contented sigh, pressing closer to Abby, and for the first time in a long, long time, the Green family slept without fear, wrapped in the warmth of trust that had taken root and finally, truly begun to bloom. The invitation came in a pale, yellow envelope, with the shelter's return address stamped in the corner. Abby found it wedged among the bills and grocery flyers on a damp May morning. She tore it open at the kitchen table, Shadow's chin resting on her knee, his tail thumping in anticipation of crumbs. Inside was a note in Mrs. Donnelly's neat, looping script. "We'd love for you and Shadow to join us at our spring adoption day. It would mean so much if you shared your story. Maybe you'll inspire another family to take a chance." Abby read it twice, her cheeks flushed with both excitement and worry. "Daddy, they want us to go back. All of us, even Shadow." Ethan glanced over from the sink, drying his hands. He caught the flicker of nerves in Abby's eyes, the same mixture of hope and fear he felt himself. It wasn't just a trip to the shelter, it was a return to the place where everything had changed, where Shadow's journey with them had begun, and where, in a way, their healing had started too. He kneeled next to Abby, hand gentle on her shoulder. "What do you think, Abs? Is Shadow ready?" Abby turned to Shadow, who watched them both with steady eyes, calm and open. "I think we're all ready, Dad." The week leading up to the event was a flurry of nerves and preparation. Abby drew a picture of Shadow, surrounded by comic book stars, planning to give it to Mrs. Donnelly. Ethan found Shadow's old collar, the one the shelter staff had labeled with warnings, and replaced it with a new blue one. Soft, sturdy, without a single mark of fear. That morning the air was fresh and full of birdsong. Abby wore her favorite yellow sundress and carefully brushed Shadow's coat until it gleamed. Ethan loaded the car with treats, water, and just in case, a muzzle. The old habits of caution ran deep, but he hoped they wouldn't need it. As they pulled into the shelter parking lot, Ethan's stomach tightened. The building looked both smaller and larger than he remembered. The memories rushed in. The chemical scent of disinfectant, the cold light in the back wing, the fear in Shadow's eyes behind the bars. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Abby, who squeezed his hand in silent reassurance. Shadow sat tall beside her, head out the window, nose twitching at the spring breeze. Inside, the shelter buzzed with life. Staff bustled between kennels, volunteers chatted with visitors, and a cluster of puppies tumbled in a playpen. Old Joe, the volunteer who'd first handed Shadow's file to Ethan, raised a hand in greeting. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, eyes twinkling. "Look at you, big guy." Shadow stayed close to Abby, posture relaxed but attentive. Ethan kept the leash loose, letting the dog choose his pace. He watched as Shadow took in the old smells and new sounds, his ears flicking but his tail wagging, slow and measured. They found Mrs. Donnelly by the front desk, her smile wide and wet-eyed. She knelt to Shadow's level, her voice low and calm. "I hardly recognize you. You look happy, Shadow. Really happy." Abby handed her the drawing. He saved a boy in the woods. And he saves me. Every day. Mrs. Donnelly brushed away a tear. Would you tell your story for the families, Abby? Some of them are thinking about fostering dogs, like Shadow, ones who've had it rough. You could help them understand what's possible. Hey, Abby nodded, nerves tight in her chest, but Shadow nuzzled her hand as if to say, we'll do this together. The event was held in the main room, kennels lining the walls, chairs circled in the center, parents with anxious kids, a few couples holding hands. At the back, a pit bull with a chewed-up ear paced in his kennel, eyes full of longing and confusion. Ethan clipped the leash to Shadow's collar and, for caution's sake, looped the muzzle over his snout, just for the entrance. They walked in together, Abby holding Shadow's leash, Ethan's hand steady at her shoulder. The room fell silent as they entered. Some remembered Shadow as the unadoptable dog, the one everyone feared. Now he walked beside Abby, posture proud, eyes gentle. Abby led him to the front, unfastened the muzzle, and knelt by his side. She took a deep breath, then began, her voice small at first but gaining strength as she spoke. Shadow was scared that when we met him, he didn't trust anyone, and everyone thought he was too broken to ever be part of a family. But we learned that you don't need to be perfect to be loved. Well, you just need someone who stays. She looked at Ethan, then back to the room. Shadow protects me. He helps me sleep when the nights are bad. He saved a boy who got lost in the woods, and he let a scared little kid at the vet pet him. He's not just our dog. He's our friend, Ethan added, voice thick with emotion. Sometimes healing is slow. Sometimes it takes months. But every day is a chance for trust to grow. We didn't give up on Shadow, and he never gave up on us. The silence broke. Soft applause, a few tears. The couple with the nervous pit bull came up after, hope shining in their eyes. Do you think we could help her? The woman asked, glancing at the trembling dog. Abby nodded, certain. You just need to be patient, and don't leave, even when it's hard. Shadow watched the room, calm amid the chaos, his tail thumping softly as strangers approached. For the first time, he accepted a treat from a volunteer's hand. He sniffed a toddler's outstretched palm and let himself be hugged by a little girl with a crooked smile. Before they left, Mrs. Donnelly pulled Ethan aside. You didn't just change Shadow's life, she said. You changed ours, too. You showed us that even the hardest stories can have good endings. As the Greens stepped into the sunlight, Abby's hand in Ethan's, Shadow walked between them. No longer afraid, no longer unadoptable. The shelter faded into the background, replaced by the laughter and voices of families finding new hope. In the car, Abby looked at her father. Do you think Shadow remembers where he came from? Ethan smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Maybe. But I think what matters is that he knows where he belongs now. Shadow curled in the back seat, eyes heavy, head on Abby's lap. The world rolled past in a blur of green and gold, and for the first time, going back felt like moving forward. Evening settled over the greenhouse with the gentle hush of late spring. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, brushing the living room in honeyed gold. Outside, the world hummed with life. Frogs in the creek, wind in the budding maples, neighbors laughing on distant porches. But inside, the peace was deeper, softer, the kind that settles only after long storms. Abby lay curled on the worn blue couch, Shadow's head heavy on her lap. She was half asleep, a comic book splayed across her chest, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Shadow dozed, his breath slow and even, tail occasionally thumping as if he dreamed of running free in open fields. Ethan watched them from the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, a quiet contentment filling his chest. There were dishes in the sink, a basket of laundry in the hall, and bills still unpaid on the kitchen counter. Yet none of those things pressed as urgently as the warmth that had finally returned to the house. For so many months, the silence here had been thick with memories, of grief, of words unsaid, of all the ways loss echoes in small, everyday rituals. But now, laughter mingled with the quiet. Shadows on the walls no longer felt threatening. It was as if the house itself had exhaled, shedding the weight of sorrow with every soft footstep of a dog who'd once belonged to no one. It was Abby who noticed the change first. Weeks before, she began leaving her door open at night, trusting that Shadow would keep his vigil. She no longer started at the sound of thunder, no longer clung to Ethan's hand in grocery stores or crowded hallways. There was a confidence in her walk, a calm steadiness in her gaze, a light that had been missing since her mother died, flickering back to life because of a dog everyone else had given up on. Oh, Ethan saw the difference in himself too. He caught glimpses of the man he used to be, a gentler, more present, less afraid of the future. There were still moments when grief threatened to swallow him, but they came less often now, softened by the daily rituals of care. Every time Shadow pressed his head into Ethan's palm, every time Abby giggled at a silly dog antic, Ethan felt the edges of his pain blur, replaced by something quieter, stronger. He was no longer just surviving, he was living again. Some nights, as he watched Abby and Shadow from the hallway, Ethan thought about how unlikely it all seemed, how easy it would have been to walk away at the shelter, to say no to the risk, to let fear dictate the shape of their lives. But instead, they'd stayed. They'd waited. They'd chosen hope, even when it looked impossible. It was a small act, really, just staying, just refusing to give up, even when trust seemed out of reach. Yet, that was what made all the difference. One night in late May, after dinner, Abby curled on the porch swing, Shadow pressed close against her legs. The air buzzed with the promise of summer. Ethan joined her, mug of tea in hand, and watched fireflies blink into existence above the yard. "Daddy," Abby said quietly, "do you think Shadow knows he's safe now?" Ethan looked at the dog, at his gentle eyes and the scar near his ear, at the way he watched over Abby with a devotion so pure, it hurt. "I think he knows," Ethan said. "I think he feels it every time you hug him, every time you let him lay with you at night, every time we come home and he's right there at the door." Abby smiled and leaned her head against Shadow's. "I feel safe too. I didn't for a long time, but I do now." Ethan reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're brave, you know, not just for helping Shadow, for letting yourself heal, for letting love in, even after you got hurt." Abby was quiet for a long moment, lost in thought. Then she whispered, "I think maybe we saved each other." Shadow's tail thumped once, as if agreeing. The seasons turned. School ended, then began again. The trees went from green to gold to bare, and then back to green. The rhythms of life flowed on, full of small joys and the quiet strength of routines. The memory of those first fearful nights faded, replaced by brighter moments. Abby and Shadow racing through the park, Ethan teaching Abby to ride her bike with Shadow loping alongside, late-night giggles echoing from the kitchen as Abby snuck Shadow a treat under the table. There were setbacks. No healing is a straight line. Sometimes a slammed door still made Shadow flinch. Sometimes Abby's eyes still filled with old grief at the mention of her mother. But every challenge was met with patience, with gentleness, with the steady promise that no one in this house would ever have to face their fear alone. At the next shelter adoption day, Abby sat beside Shadow in the center of the room, reading aloud from her comics as children gathered around. Some were scared, some too shy to speak, but one by one, they reached out to pet the big, gentle dog. Shadow let them, his eyes calm, his tail sweeping the floor. Abby ended her story the same way each time. He just needed someone who stayed. That's all. As twilight stretched across the Vermont hills, Ethan tucked Abby into bed, pausing to watch Shadow curl up beside her. The house was quiet, peaceful. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, then whispered, to no one, and everyone, "Thank you." It was never really clear, in the end, who had saved whom. Perhaps that's how all real healing works. not as a gift from one to another, but as something built together, moment by moment, in the space between wounded hearts.